Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, a deep dive on the costs and benefits of climate change impacts and adaptation chapter of the National Issues Report. This is the fourth and final webinar in our winter webinar series, stemming from the chapters of the National Issues Report. My name is Chris Jennings. I'll be the moderator today. I'm the director of the Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation Division at Natural Resources Canada, and we're the unit that leads Canada's national assessment process. Those of you who have been joining us for the series will have seen the lead editor for the national assessment process, Fiona Warren, performing this function in previous webinars. Claire Sanders is joining us today from the Climate Risk Institute. She'll be available during the webinar if you run into audio or technical issues. If you need to ask Claire a question, open the chat box and use the drop-down arrow, locate Claire Sanders, and you can send her a private message. Please note, everyone, that your microphones have been muted to avoid any audio distractions for our presenters or any feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until the end. Please feel free to type out your questions during the presentation in the Q&A box. La présentation sera en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser des questions en anglais ou en français selon votre choix. Aussi, les présentations sont disponibles dans les deux langues officielles sur notre site web. We're recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending out a link to everyone who has registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides. This is a virtual event, as just about every event is these days. And we're gathered today across the traditional and unceded territories of many Indigenous peoples. On behalf of those of us in the National Capital Region, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. I invite you to use the chat function to enter your own land acknowledgement from wherever you're joining us today. The National Issues Report was released in June, and it focuses on climate change impacts and adaptation issues that are of national importance or that are best understood through an integrated pan-Canadian perspective. It clearly demonstrates that climate change is already affecting many aspects of our lives, that the impacts will persist, and in most cases intensify, and that more action is urgently needed on adaptation. Like all of our reports, it's available at changingclimate.ca. Today's webinar is going to focus on the costs and benefits chapter of the impacts and adaptation. Sorry, let me try that again. We'll focus on the costs and benefits of climate change impacts and adaptation chapter. And the sequence of words there does matter. That chapter assesses the state of knowledge and practice on climate change impacts and adaptation economics in Canada. I'm pleased today to be able to welcome the speakers, people who co-led and authored the chapter. First, I'd like to introduce Richard Boyd. Richard is the Director of Research and Economics at All One Sky Foundation. He's an environmental economist whose research interests include climate change vulnerability assessment and economic decision-making methodologies, and facilitating a just and equitable transition to a climate-resilient, low-carbon future. Over the last 25 years, he has led numerous assessments of the socioeconomic impacts of climate change on human health, the built environment, and natural assets, as well as the costs and benefits of adaptation strategies to inform decision-making at all levels of government, both within Canada and internationally. I'm also happy to welcome Richard's co-author, Anil Markandeya. Professor Markandeya is a resource economist who has worked extensively on the links between human health and environmental burdens, including air pollution. He was a lead author for the third, fourth, and fifth IPCC assessment reports on climate change, as well as a contributor to the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. Currently, he's Distinguished Iker Basque Professor at the Basque Center for Climate Change in Spain and Honorary Professor of Economics at the University of Bath in the UK. On behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Richard and Anil for presenting this webinar for us today. It's much appreciated. And without further ado, I'll turn things over to Richard.
Okay, great. Thank you very much there for the kind introductions, Chris. Um, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on behalf of Anil and myself. In terms of what we'll cover today, we'll start with an introduction to the objectives of the chapter, then work through each of its 7 key messages. Following the presentation of the key messages, we'll look at some emerging themes and knowledge gaps from the assessment before wrapping up with question and answer period. The overarching goal of the chapter, as Chris just mentioned, was to assess the current state of knowledge and practice in Canada relating to the use of economics to inform adaptation planning. As a starting point, we sort of set out identifying a number of key questions that decision makers and adaptation practitioners would like to see addressed. And these questions are listed there on the slide. In terms of like the structure of the chapter, it was built around the answers that the current literature within Canada would allow us in terms of answering these questions. I think it's fair to say that this is the first time a chapter on adaptation economics has been included within the National Knowledge Assessment. So we were given a little bit of leeway by the Secretary at NRCan regarding the scope of the chapter. So some of the material in the chapter might be thought of more sort of capacity building on the topic of adaptation economics, rather than specifically about the state of play within Canada. I'll now pass you over to my co-author, Anil, who will discuss the first couple of key messages.
Hello, everybody, welcome to our webinar. So let me start by talking about how economics analysis can help to inform adaptation planning. So within the literature, economics serves several important functions at specific stages within an adaptive or iterative climate risk management framework. So we have in this chart in front of us 2 sides. The first side, which the left-hand side describes what we might call the problem definition. And at this stage, the analysis economics can help with what we might call the awareness and assessment phases of the analysis. So in terms of purpose, the measurement, valuation, and analysis of economic impacts can help define the scale of the challenge faced by decision makers and the urgency for action. Economic information can also help with the prioritization of climate-related threats and opportunities. For example, the costs or economic impacts are typically included in consequence scales used to rate the materiality of climate impact drivers. Regarding the problem definition, the methodological framing for the use of economic information is here is one of risk assessment. On the right-hand side of the slide, economics also plays a role during the planning phase, during regarding the definition of what we might call the solution set. Specifically, economics can help with the appraisal of trade-offs among adaptation options, providing both information on costs and benefits and some tools to process and summarize that information. This information reveals whether and to what level of adaptation is justified from an economic efficiency perspective. It also helps set priorities across the available options. So during the planning phase, the methodological framework is one of decision analysis. Can we move to the next slide? So now that we're familiar with the key building blocks, so what do these costs of inaction, what are the costs of inaction and what are the net benefits? So this slide here shows us that there are different dimensions to both the costs and benefits. In general, quite a vast array of terms is used to describe climate change and adaptation cost benefits in the literature. Ideally, economic analysis should capture all the economic impacts, but that's not always practical because of resource and information constraints. When reviewing and interpreting the results of economic studies of adaptation, knowledge of the full range of the costs, even if you can't actually estimate them, will help you better understand and convey the limitations of studies and help avoid making inappropriate cross-study comparisons. Most studies out there have quite different scopes and assumptions, and making appropriate comparisons is very difficult, as you will see later in our presentation. So as you can see in the slides, the costs or the benefits can be defined on two dimensions. Vertically, we have the direct and the indirect impacts. The indirect impacts are so-called ripple or cascading effects along value chains and the wider economy. Horizontally, we have what the tangible or market impacts and the intangible or non-market impacts. And the quadrants show some examples of direct and indirect tangible impacts. Tangible effects, if large enough, can be reflected in changes to some of the macroeconomic indicators, like changes to GDP, changes in employment, and household incomes. Some of the studies of climate change impacts will use models, economic models, that directly estimate and report changes in projected GDP attributable to climate change. Can we move to the next slide? So this slide fills out the different quadrants a little bit more. The direct and indirect tangible impacts, which are captured in provincial and national economic accounts, the direct and the indirect tangible impacts are only paint a partial picture of the true costs of climate change for Canadians. What economists really want to know is the aggregate welfare losses attributable to climate change. This includes climate impacts to many things we value as individuals, but that do not have market prices, the so-called intangibles on the left of the diagram. For example, climate hazards can directly damage natural capital and impair the provision of ecosystem services, and directly impact human health, resulting in illness, disease, and loss of life. These are not goods and services traded in markets with readily observable market prices. At the same time, a range of intangible effects can result indirectly from the direct effects, like chronic mental health disorders or the exacerbation of existing inequalities in society. Importantly, evidence suggests that these intangibles can be significant and this is important, they can be larger than the conventional market-based costs. You will see this when we look at public health examples later. From an economics perspective, then, the true costs of climate change are given by the overall welfare losses experienced by society, encompassing both direct and indirect, tangible and intangible economic impacts. Something to note, you will often hear economists using the term welfare losses and social costs interchangeably. In practice, though, most Canadian study capture direct and occasionally indirect tangible impacts and very rarely intangible impacts. Most economic analysis reviewed for this assessment, thus we found them to be incomplete. And no surprise, those studies that capture the full range of potential impacts shown tend to result in significantly larger projected costs. We can move to the next slide then. And perhaps, Richard, you can take over and give some more details.
Sure. Okay. As we're moving on here within the chapter, before we set out reviewing evidence of the projected economic impacts of climate change for Canada, we assessed information on the costs of past climate-related events in order to see what they suggest about how the future might evolve. And with climate change anticipated to intensify some extreme weather events, an appreciation of current vulnerabilities and gaps in our preparedness within Canada is a good starting point for sort of building an economic case for early adaptation in order to avoid potentially rising damage costs. Our assessment focused on one line of evidence, that being annual insured losses from weather-related disasters between 1983 and 2018, which was the data available at the time of drafting the chapter. And these are shown by the height of the blue and orange bars there on the slide. We focused on one line of evidence, which is a limitation, but for example, insured losses actually only account for a fraction of total economic or tangible costs, and an even smaller fraction of total welfare losses associated with these events. And also the insurance data doesn't account for or capture slow onset impacts. Nevertheless, what does this evidence show? Well, insured losses from weather-related events in Canada are both significant and rising. Losses averaged about 0.4 billion annually between 1983 and 2007, but close to about 2 billion annually in the subsequent decade. Also, like overall, there's a statistically significant upward trend in inflation adjusted losses, shown by the blue solid line there on the graph. Also, like within the data, there's a rightward skewing of the loss distributions annually, and a corresponding increasing trend in the most extreme loss events as well as occurring. These sort of trends and losses are indicative of a current adaptation deficit within Canada, and of increasing future risks if action is not taken to address this gap within our preparedness. And as you'll see later towards the end of the presentation, reasons for the observed adaptation gap include a range of market behavioral and policy failures that warrant early intervention on the part of government. In terms of the trend in losses, most of the rising losses are due to growing exposures and rising asset values, but this doesn't explain all of the rising trend. Even like after removing the influence of increasing exposures of people, assets, and growing wealth to extreme weather events over time, in addition to controlling for general price inflation, there's still a statistically significant upward trend in losses, as shown by the solid orange line there on the bar chart. And so this sort of suggests that climate change may already be playing a role in rising losses from these weather-related extremes, especially when considered in tandem with the findings of the attribution studies within the Canada and the Changing Climate Report. For example, like the role that climate change played in the Alberta floods of 2013 and the Fort McMurray fires of 2016. Now looking forward into the future, to supplement the assessment of observed costs for historic extreme weather related events, the next section of the chapter reviewed available evidence relating to the projected future costs and some benefits of climate change for Canada. both looking at the sort of aggregate picture as well as the sort of picture for specific regions, select climate sensitive sectors, and a few cities within the country. The overall message from this review of projected future costs is that the economic consequences of climate change for Canada will be overwhelmingly negative and significant. As the on the slide there's a few example sort of summaries from some of the studies that we reviewed. And from these examples on the slides, you can see that the available evidence is suggesting there on the upper left that climate change will adversely impact the rate of economic growth within Canada. For example, that study finds that temperature-induced reductions in labor productivity are estimated to reduce projected GDP per capita by about 13% in 2100 and 4.4% in 2050. Also, climate change is projected to have negative economic consequences for forestry, our coastal regions, and the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region as well, primarily, or well, specifically from low water levels, and also for public health. These are the areas for which studies were available at the time of drafting the chapter. And just before moving on to illustrate the sort of significance of the intangible costs that Anil was talking about earlier, and the study for Quebec there on the upper right of the slide puts the welfare losses of excess mortality due to the impacts of climate change on temperature extremes, vector-borne diseases, and aeroallergens at about 35 billion in present value terms over a 50-year period. The available evidence also suggests that climate change will have negative economic impacts within our sort of urban areas, municipalities, and potentially these costs could be quite significant, especially when intangible impacts are included. And that is demonstrated within the Edmonton case story within the chapter. But there are several studies that do suggest that some climate-sensitive sectors will benefit from climate change. Two of the more sort of prominent examples are increased output from tourism expenditures that are associated with basically more people internationally visiting Canada, and also more Canadians doing staycations at home. And these benefits also studies are also showing benefits for agriculture in terms of increased land values, increased output and GDP associated with sort of increased crop yields and production from crop farms. However, I think it's worth introducing a caveat in that these studies don't capture the full implications of climate change for each of these sectors. Which means that the overall net impact is probably a bit more unclear than these studies are suggesting, and maybe that the case for the net benefits being shown here is not as rosy as the sort of literature is suggesting. And for example, there within the agricultural studies, they don't consider impacts on livestock, which is susceptible to heat stress. Or some of the other challenges that may be presented to the sector by climate change, including water availability, extreme weather events, and pests and diseases. Before moving on, it is worth stressing that at the time of preparing the assessment, information on the projected economic impacts of future climate change for Canada is limited to a few climate-sensitive sectors, a few regions, and importantly, few urban centers within the country, which is where most of the adaptation decisions actually take place. And sort of given the availability, given that the available evidence really only covers a subset of the full extent of potential economic impacts of climate change for Canada, and based on what we know from research and other studies, it's fair to conclude that, that the projected costs of climate change for Canada that are presented in the chapter are likely quite conservative, really underestimating the magnitude of the potential future costs. In addition to seeking evidence on the economic consequences of climate change, which the previous few slides looked at, decision makers are also increasingly requesting information on the costs, benefits of adaptation options and choices, as well as some of the other trade-offs that are involved in making those choices. For example, balancing up concerns around equity. The next section of the chapter reviewed available economic tools that support adaptation decision-making. And this was done primarily to build some capacity in these tools, but also to provide context for the subsequent section of the chapter, which reviewed their application in Canada. In general, economics as a subject offers a range of tools that can help decision makers appraise adaptation options in the face of, in the face of uncertain information, and to illustrate and illuminate trade-offs between different decision criteria, as well as, of course, to generate information on the costs and benefit of alternative courses of action. But one of the more important things to note here is that the appropriate economic tool to be used to inform decision-making is really unique to the adaptation decision problem at hand. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and each decision support tool has strengths and weaknesses depending on the adaptation context at hand. And this is probably best illustrated when it comes to managing uncertainty in the decision-making process, which is what the diagram there on the slide is attempting to show. Within an adaptation context, potentially deep uncertainties can arise over both the magnitude of the problem at hand, that is our understanding of the climate risks we face, as well as our understanding about the future performance of our adaptation options. And so we can have uncertainties ranging from low to quite deep uncertainties with respect to both those dimensions, which are reflected on the axes within the figure. Now, when uncertainties regarding both future risks and adaptation options are low, which is in the sort of bottom left-hand corner there, it is generally okay to use traditional economic decision support tools like cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis, which essentially look to identify a sort of optimal welfare maximizing solution today, given a relatively certain view of the near-term future. And this works best, the application of these tools within that context works best for short-lived, no-regret type adaptation options that primarily address the current adaptation deficit. However, we all are aware of the sort of ballooning or cascading uncertainties associated with the adaptation and decision problems. And when these uncertainties relating to future risks or the performance of our adaptation options rise, or rise both together, newer approaches for the economic analysis of adaptation options is necessary and preferred. And some of these methods include a group called sort of robust analysis methods. There's also the application of modern portfolio theory. And when faced with deep uncertainties regarding both dimensions, then the appropriate economics decision support tool would be based around dynamic adaptation pathways. It's worth noting that these tools still employ cost-benefit analysis or cost-effectiveness analysis, but they do so in a way that manages uncertainty in a much better manner. The next, building upon the previous section of the chapter, was build capacity around the tools that are available and their strengths and weaknesses. The next section of the chapter reviewed the application of these decision support tools within Canada. But it's worth mentioning that, or stressing that currently, at the time the chapter was put together, there are only sort of ex-ante prospective applications of traditional cost-benefit analysis within Canada. There's no applications of these sort of more innovative decision support tools that better capture and manage uncertainty within a decision-making process. The slide there shows a sample of, it summarizes a sample of 60 cost-benefit analyses of individual adaptation projects that we reviewed for the chapter. Most of these projects are to mitigate coastal flooding and from storm surge and sea level rise, along with erosion risk in Atlantic Canada and Quebec. And these are shown, you can see there the dominant yellow and orange colors within the bar chart. A few studies also that were available looked at projects in other sectors like human health, a couple of red bar projects there, and then also water levels within the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence region, shown by the blue bars. The bar chart itself there shows the estimated benefit cost ratio, and that is the sort of present value benefits divided by the present value costs of these projects. And the height of each bar shows the size of the benefit cost ratio, which is measured there on the vertical axis. And in terms of a decision rule, a benefit cost ratio greater than 1 means that the present value benefits exceed the present value costs, and thus it passes a traditional economic cost benefit test. The main conclusion to draw from this review, from the review of these projects, is that the benefits of actions to adaptation, or the benefits of actions to adapt to climate change, generally exceed the costs of doing so, and sometimes potentially significantly. Sort of 75% of the projects reviewed passed the cost-benefit test. Which sort of overall suggests that there's a reasonable economic case for proactive investment within in adaptation. And this is a small sample of projects that we were able to review. But looking into at experience internationally, the results are definitely consistent with international experience and similar, which shows similar benefit cost ratios. So what else did we conclude from the review of these sort of economic appraisals? The slide here is categorizing the same 60 projects by 4 broad types of action. We have our soft policy options like strategic retreat, zoning restrictions, or enhanced pest control within forestry. And there's also soft engineered actions like constructive wetlands or beach nourishment. And then hard engineered actions like manufactured dikes and seawalls, and then combination actions as well. And then across the sample of projects, when we look at them in terms of the project type, it was evident that the soft adaptation actions performed better in that they had much higher benefit cost ratios than the hard engineered actions. And so you might ask why that's the case. And it's primarily because the soft measures had much lower capital costs for a similar level of risk mitigation. And in some cases, they also provided significant co-benefits, in particular the engineered soft options. Sort of more generally, the economic performance of adaptation actions is really quite site and project specific. That's definitely something to bear in mind from the review of these projects within the chapter. A similar sort of adaptation action that generates large net benefits at one site may not necessarily do so at another site, because it really depends on sort of the baseline economic risks that are being addressed, the life cycle adaptation costs of the measure, as well as the scope of the measure to generate co-benefits and avoid externalities. It's also worth quite important to note, and it's not shown there on the slide, is that the review of projects within the section also revealed that adaptation does not generally cancel out all climate change costs. Some level of residual damages or losses is generally still incurred, which brings us to the sort of final section of the chapter. Within the final section of the chapter, we assess the role that economics plays in defining limits to adaptation and what that might mean for decision makers and policymakers. From an economic perspective, there is an expectation, in theory, that businesses and households will undertake a significant amount of adaptation themselves as they sort of modify what they do in response to climate signals in a sort of ongoing effort to maximize profit or maximize well-being. But there's also substantial evidence out there that autonomous adaptation by businesses and households is not always adequate nor efficient. Which means that the amount of adaptation needed to cancel out sort of all negative impacts attributable to climate change is really not likely to be realized. And this diagram is trying to illustrate this sort of subset of adaptation that's actually reflected in policy potential relative to the overall adaptation needs, which is much larger in scale. So, for a start, there are a range of sort of technical and ecological limits, which will define the maximum potential for adaptation and what impacts are actually unavoidable due to these technical and ecological constraints. And further, like only a subset of this maximum potential will be economically viable, as not all adaptation actions under consideration by businesses or households will actually pass a cost-benefit test, and therefore will be, would be considered for implementation. And this is largely due to a range of different distortions created by the presence of multiple barriers, including a range of different sort of market, behavioral, and policy failures. And in order to sort of overcome those failures and assist businesses and households with their adaptation choices, government intervention is required to remove these barriers. But at the same time, not all of these interventions themselves will pass a cost-benefit test. So ultimately, what's actually achievable, within the sort of overall achievable potential, will only be a subset of the economic potential. And then finally, there at the bottom, we have our policy potential, which is really reflecting the fact that not all of what's potentially achievable will likely be realized in practice due to a range of sort of funding and institutional capacity constraints within our governments. So sort of all in all, what this is sort of saying is that in addition to the sort of technical and ecological limits, which define unavoidable impacts, economic considerations also play an important role in defining the limits of adaptation. And an economically efficient level of adaptation is not likely, will likely involve accepting some amount of residual damages or residual losses. And the magnitude of these will be governed by the extent of the sort of unavoidable impacts. So the sort of presence of these sort of market and behavioral and sort of policy barriers to efficient action within businesses and households sort of points to a role for government in order to help the market equitably meet its sort of adaptation needs. And this really entails reforming existing policy distortions that impede adaptation decision-making in the private sector. This also will involve formulating and implementing a range of regulatory and economic instruments to address these market and behavioral failures. Really to sort of provide the correct signals or appropriate signals for the private sector to adapt efficiently. And also providing sort of public goods that support adaptation. Things like, for example, the climate information data services and large-scale infrastructure projects like large, seawalls or flood defenses. And then also, given the realization that residual costs or losses are also likely, then there's a role for government to sort of reconcile and support disadvantaged and underserved groups within Canada in order to address the sort of distributional consequences associated with adaptation and the residual losses. And sort of a comment more generally, from these limits to adaptation, is that there's really, it points towards a sort of strong and urgent need for near-term reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in order to avoid exceeding these adaptation limits and incurring larger residual costs as we move forward into the future. So quickly, just wrap up here with highlighting a few of the knowledge gaps that we identified. At the time of writing this study, there was definitely only a subset of climate sensitive sectors were captured. There was only, within the literature, and there was gaps regarding, tourism, fisheries, energy, transportation, infrastructure, and water resources. But since the publication, there has been great work being done out there, and in particular by the Canadian Institute of Climate Choices. It has some studies recently released that looks at a bit more detail on public health and climate impacts regarding energy and the transportation systems within the country. So these gaps are being addressed. There's also not much evidence with regards to the economic consequences of compounding or cascading climate impact drivers, and also gaps regarding the sort of aggregate understanding of adaptation spending requirements and what that looks like by sector. And this is sort of points towards a gap in understanding the sort of scale of the adaptation funding requirement that we may require as we move forward into the future. And there's also a range of different other gaps there listed on the slide. And one of the ones that I was highlighting earlier was the fact that there are only applications of economic decision support tools within Canada at the moment are traditional cost benefit analysis. And there's no practical applications of these other alternative decision support tools, which are much better at managing and conveying uncertainty within a decision-making process. In terms of some of the issues that were emerging within the chapter, it's like, as I stressed before, there's definitely an argument that the economics of consequences of climate change are much higher than the evidence within the chapter is currently suggesting. And also, as I was showing there towards the end, that there's definitely a case for a larger role for governments, both to support sufficient adaptation within the private sector beyond the provision of funding and the provision of public goods, but also with respect to managing the distributional consequences of adaptation, costs and benefits and residual losses. And then also, there needs to be a bit more work done in terms of developing economic tools and specifically applications of those tools within Canada to meet the sort of evolving needs of our decision makers, particularly like I was stressing there, using tools that are better capable of avoiding maladaptation in the face of deep uncertainties. And also more development of tools with respect to the assessment of nature-based and behavioral-based adaptation options is also something that's emerging as a need that needs to be addressed. So yeah, I wrap up there and thank you very much for listening to the webinar, and I think we'll shift off to questions and answers.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Anil, for the presentation. And you're right, we will now shift our attention to, we have about 15 minutes left for a question and answer period. Thanks to everyone who has already taken the advice to enter your questions in the Q&A tab in Zoom. We have a body of them to start with, but if you still have a question that you'd like to hear our presenters answer, you can continue to present it in the Q&A box and in the official language of your choice. And so with that, I'd like to start with a question that I think is probably best directed to Richard. And it's one that I think I see coming up in a bit of a, well, I guess there's a thematic continuance to it, but it's the question of whether or not our adaptation initiatives are keeping pace with the risks of current weather extremes and future climate changes. And I think of that particularly as having a connection to some questions that are in the chat about the flooding in BC. So maybe I can turn that over to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, the evidence that we looked at and presented there with respect to the trends within the insurance data is definitely suggesting that we're not keeping up and that we're sort of inadequately prepared for the current extreme weather related events that we're seeing at the moment, and with projections that these things will intensify and get worse. It's only it's definitely painting a picture that the losses that we're seeing at the moment is just a prelude to even larger losses going forward. So I definitely say we're not keeping up with risks at the moment. And in terms of adaptation and managing uncertainty, it's best to focus in on addressing the current adaptation deficit, because it's kind of no regret. You're getting benefits immediately, regardless of how the future might evolve.
Anil, did you want to add to that?
No, I think I agree with what Richard said, that we do have a significant adaptation deficit. I would also note that addressing this deficit is not going to be instantaneous, because it will take adjustment in terms of the way in which people organize their lives and where they live in order to be able to not have to face the kinds of extreme events and consequences we have seen rather alarmingly in the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, maybe a second question, which I think is kind of the other side of that question, which is that given all of the costs of impacts, we've talked a little bit about the opportunities. And some of our questions have focused on some of the benefits that we might anticipate. I wonder if we could treat this as a little bit of a three-parter. One is, could I give you the opener, which is to talk a little bit more about some of the benefits we might expect. And then we have some follow-up questions about how we need to treat those potential opportunities when they might have consequences for our decarbonization goals, as well as things like land value. And how far we go when considering the opportunities in understanding what those consequences might be.
Richard, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll just start because it's the first part of the question there is reflecting part of what we presented.
Yes.
The two more prominent sectors where benefits are anticipated are both with respect to the agricultural sector, primarily crop farms, and then also within the tourism industry. In terms of increased expenditure and economic multipliers associated with that. But I think it's like I was trying to emphasize there that those studies are rather limited in scope. And they're suggesting quite significant benefits, but when the full scope of the potential implications of climate change are taken into account, like for example, with respect to extreme weather and water availability and pests and disease within agriculture, and within the tourism sector, the capacity constraints within the industry, and the fact that the international tourism flows don't account for the impacts of climate change and associated income losses in other countries, which might affect their ability to afford trips to Canada. Those things aren't accounted for. So this picture of benefits may not be quite as rosy as the studies that we looked at sort of portrays. And then, there's also, with respect to the balance between utility bills associated with heating demand versus cooling demand, and the extent to which is there an overall net savings, as well as another area where there's potential benefits. I don't know if you want to add anything further there.
Yes, perhaps I would, Richard. I think a couple of questions asked about opportunities through improved access via transportation and possible access to exploitation of fossil fuel resources, and in a sense that economics and cost benefit analysis does not take a position on this. So if these are genuine benefits that arise, opportunities that arise because of climate change, then they ought to be evaluated, and if they do generate benefits, those should be taken into account. Now, of course, the point that some of these activities will also contribute to climate change is important, but that contribution would be on the negative side, but against which we would have to take to value all the positive effects. And if on balance, exploiting these opportunities is desirable, then they should be included as possible benefits of that the country needs to take into account. It's not that we ought to automatically exclude them.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add there that within cost benefit analysis, best practice would actually involve monetizing or quantifying and monetizing the co-benefits, and also any externalities.
And the costs, externalities, yeah, exactly.
To be associated with pricing that increase.
And also, one of the people in the chat asked that we hadn't included some possible gains in forests, which might occur because of improved forest growth. I don't know if you have something on that, Richard.
The studies that were reviewed within the chapter, all of those studies suggest losses within the forestry sector from temperature-related reductions in products.
That's what I remember too.
Forest fires and pests. So none of the studies that we reviewed were suggesting that there's actually benefits for the sector, but they were focused primarily on output and not necessarily anything associated with recreation or a use of the forest.
Thank you. A slightly more technical question. Can you provide more detail on how the projected impacts from heat to national productivity and GDP were calculated?
There are empirical relationships within the literature in terms of the labor supply, like how much an individual is willing to work at different levels of temperature. And once that temperature crosses specific thresholds, getting into the sort of higher end, their willingness to supply work reduces, and the productivity of the work that they do supply also reduces. And so based on those empirical relationships, and you link those to changes in projected temperatures above certain thresholds, you can estimate a reduction in the amount of labor hours that is supplied within specific sectors. And then you multiply that by the value of the labor output per hour that's lost, and then integrate that within probably within a macroeconomic model that then accounts for the sort of cascading effects across multiple sectors. And then that sort of scenario with the reduction in labor in response to climate-induced temperature change is then compared with a scenario that does not involve the rising temperatures, and the difference is the cost.
Neil, anything to add?
Only to say that there's a major study by the Lancet Countdown, which has done exactly that for not only for Canada, but for all the countries globally to estimate the productivity effects of heat and over the last 20 to 25 years. Thank you.
Yeah. I'd also just add there that the Institute for Canadian Institute for Climate Choices has also released a study last year that looked at the public health effects of climate change in Canada and across provinces, and it included labor productivity. So there's quite a lot of detail within that report on how to do this type of analysis.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more, and I'd like to try and, again, group a few of the questions that are focusing on the need for tools that you could recommend for climate change risk and adaptation options for cost-benefit analysis, which I think comes down into some of the questions around a good example of an adaptation pathways decision-making tool, or the use of tools by industry and business, including in response to increased efforts to consider climate-related financial disclosures, including physical risks. So that's a little bit of a grab bag of questions related to tools that people might have recourse to and some of the drivers for how those tools might be used.
Do you want me to start there, Neil?
Yes, please.
In terms of like the toolkit that's available, I think I was showing there that there are a range of tools, some better than others at dealing with uncertainty, and probably the best one for dealing with uncertainty is the sort of adaptation pathways approach. But as I also was saying there, that there's no applications in Canada of these tools, at least at the time of writing, and I'm still not aware of any applications. So it's all basically traditional cost benefit analysis. But the tools are there. They have been applied internationally. And I think within the chapter, there are some references to applications internationally, which people could look at, in a bit more detail to see how they work and what their sort of strengths are. And then there's also the sort of original first application of pathways with respect to the Thames Barrier in London. And that's a case story also within the chapter. But in terms of applications at the moment, there just aren't any within Canada. But those tools exist, and people making long life decisions, with respect to like planning or infrastructure investments, they should really be using one of these tools as opposed to just traditional cost benefit or cost effectiveness analysis.
Great. Well, thank you again, Anil and Richard. And thank you to everyone on the call today, on the webinar today, for all of the excellent questions. I hope we did some measure of good work in addressing as many of them as we could. And a big thank you to everyone who's participated in the entire National Issues Report Winter Webinar Series. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your engaged participation. And you can watch or rewatch all of the webinars in the series by navigating to the National Issues Report newsroom on changingclimate.ca. And that, of course, is the website where you can also see the report and see some of the content that Richard and Anil have alluded to in the presentation today, if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and I think that does it for us today.